Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, Joel Smith will be speaking to us about suicide prevention. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Joel Smith. He is the former programs director of FISP-Florida Initiative on Suicide Prevention. He now works in Deerfield Beach at Community Cares, I believe, as the director. And so I'm going to let him share the information that he has with us today. It's really valuable information. I hope everybody takes away a little something from it. We're going to be putting all of our information in the chat. So at the end, if you need to reach out to NAMI Palm Beach County or NAMI Broward, you'll have their information there, and also Joel Smith's as well. So thank you very much, Joel. Go ahead.
Thank you, everybody, and good evening. I've spent most of my life working on wellness issues and trying to create environments that are sensitive and meaningful for people as they pursue what I prefer to call the arc of wellness rather than the arc of poor health. But I have, over the last 3 or 4 years, gotten very committed to, involved in, and working to address and understand the arc by suicide. So I will tell you just a couple of quick things. I put obviously my phone number is in the chat. That is my cell phone. You're welcome to call me at any time. I do not intend to trigger anyone tonight, but this is triggering kind of information. And also I am cognizant that there are times when people think of things later that they might want to discuss or talk about. It's a responsibility I take seriously. And then I've also given my new email there. I will just quickly say that I am now the executive director of Deerfield Beach Community Cares. This work is a system of care approach to community wellness, which began for me many years ago, but more specifically about 18 months ago when we lost 2 young adults, 2 seniors, or a senior and a junior at Deerfield Beach High School, to death by suicide. Unfortunately, it was death by suicide by train. So becoming close to those families and working in that community, I wanted to take a leap and address the arc of issues that challenge us as we go through our lives. I want to jump right into the presentation that I have for you. Okay, so again, my name is there. And I'm going to jump right in. So let's talk about a few bullet points in the arc of suicide. You may or may not know that it is one of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States, and by the way, in the world. That in 2019, we lost more than 47,000 people to death by suicide, 47,500. An astronomical number of people who died by suicide. And by the way, these numbers leave out overdoses, which cannot necessarily be attributed to a purposeful suicide, leave out one-car crashes where there's no note to determine that a person chose to run their car into a tree. So these are purely identifiable deaths by suicide. In the 20 years between 1999 and 2019, national rate of suicide increased 32%, from roughly 10 people per 100,000 to almost 14 people per 100,000. Again, astronomical increases. In 2019, almost 1.5 million US adults, we're not talking about adolescents or kids, reported attempting death by suicide. 3.5 million adults reported actually making a plan. They may not have made the attempt, but they've made a plan. And 12 million, which is about, I think, 4% of the total United States population, had serious thoughts of death by suicide. So the cost of death by suicide is, in that year, $93 billion. When you take into account the personal loss, the family expenses, the cost for EMTs, BSO, and all of that across the country, $93 billion. So if you're not a warm, sensitive person and you don't care, but you care about dollars and cents, that's a big chunk of dollars. And of course, we all do care emotionally. Because of this, a national strategy for suicide prevention was released in 2000. And as I told you that the increase over this period of time was over 30%, the national strategy really was not very effective. So it was updated in 2012. And suicide has now developed its own following amongst mental health leaders in the country, almost to the point, which concerns me a little, about not seeing it as the end of the arc of wellness, but seeing it as its own thing. And yes, it is its own thing. But we realize that suicide prevention efforts are not just about Kate or Larry or Joel or Sandra or anyone else. It's not only about the individual. Yes, the individual is critical. We're the one that's suffering. But it's about all segments of our economy, all segments of our culture, public health, how we treat people when they go into treatment. I'm sure many of you have heard stories about Baker Acts and how challenging they are both going in and coming out. So all kinds of things like that. Our social services, how we view people, obviously our veterans coming back from overseas tours and seeing what they've seen. All of our entities must address these issues. And we're now a little better at being informed by the data. We're guided by the needs of the groups that are impacted by this. So I'm going to go off script for just a second and share with you a story that I'm aware of. There's a phenomenon in the suicide research world now called the psychological autopsy. And there are good and bad pieces to it, in my opinion. But the point is, if a person dies by suicide, a group would go out and speak to all of the people that they could, their loved ones, their friends, their co-workers, to try and paint a picture of what were the factors that ultimately tripped or triggered that person to make the final decision. And where one of the places this came from, now you can feel good or bad about that one way or the other. I have some reservations about that because I have sort of a generic feeling that, well, we'll get to that part in a little bit and I'll come back to that. But it came out of a military reserve group from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the providers, the VA, all of a sudden saw a spike in deaths by suicide from these returning veterans in the reserve. And they did these investigations. And what they discovered was the city of Baton Rouge, in an effort to be cost effective, consolidated some bus stops. And the bus stop that a number of these veterans gathered at to get to the VA was moved, which created a stressful situation for the veterans and created an increase in loss of life. So there's some valid reason to do some of this research when you can find some responses like that. So obviously they put back that bus stop, and that didn't mitigate all deaths by suicide, but it mitigated them being caused by that. So we do need to look at focusing on the individual, but also the groups that are at risk. I would stop if we were face to face and I would say, who are the most at risk people to death by suicide? Who are the most at risk group? And typically what many people say are young people. And again, I would tease this out if we were face to face, but the truth of the matter is, both nationally and locally, the most at risk group for death by suicide are roughly 40 to 60-year-old men, and predominantly white men. The second most at-risk group are all adults over 60. So if you stop and think about that a little bit, 40 to 60-year-old men are theoretically in the prime of their wage earning and family life. And what's happened to our culture? What's happened to the jobs that are out there? The level of stress on some of these people. Also, that group often is filled with first responders, returning veterans. So there's a high level of PTSD and stress in there. The elderly, a group we don't often think of, and some of that is masked. But when you think about our culture over the last 50 years, so many of us have left the family homestead. You know, Kate lives in Miami, and for a period of time, she moved back to her family and is now moving back to Miami. But that's 30 miles. Many of us go thousands of miles to search for jobs and new kinds of lives. And the elderly are kind of left behind in their homestead. And if the shows us that as hearing loss occurs, depression sets in. As eyesight diminishes, depression sets in. And of course, I think we can all agree that depression is the linchpin for death by suicide. So you've all heard the story of people standing by a river and seeing all these babies come down the river, and they're at risk of drowning. And people jump in the river to take the babies out, save the babies. And one smart guy walks away. And then, where are you going? Where are you going? I'm going upstream to build a dam. The point is, we need to look at ways before it gets to that crisis point in the arc of wellness for our culture and our individuals. So we know, and so much work has been done recently about the impact of trauma on the quality of our life. And trauma creates a visceral and a physical response in the body, which impacts the brain, and I'm going to get to a little bit more about that in just a few minutes, which changes our brain chemistry, changes the functionality of our brain. So we need to look at helping people become resilient from the traumas that they've lived with. And we've all faced trauma, and some of us are more resilient than others. And we also don't all know what our triggers are. We may know them, we may not know what some of them are. And we end up triggering each other either intentionally, in the case of my wife, of course, or inadvertently, where we don't know that we're triggering that person. So in a culture, we're talking about unemployment, lack of safe and affordable housing. All of these things have not historically been considered the triggers for death by suicide. And pollution, not only the fact that we live in some polluted environments, but what that pollution does to our physiology. We don't know, for example, what the outcomes are going to be in Flint, Michigan from all of that tainted water from all those years. And those are long-term kind of interventions. The impact of terrorism. We live in a traumatic time, not knowing. Obviously, COVID, living under this social isolation. And it would not be right if I did not say 400 years of systemic racism and the impact of that, particularly on our Black and brown brothers and sisters who have been told over and over and over and over and over, a better time's a coming. And you have to live with that, and it doesn't come. And the impact of that on chemical flow in the body is untold. And by the way, so much of the research done addressing racism is done by white folk. Black researchers are funded at about 15% less than white researchers. So there's some reason to question whether or not the research that's being done, while intending to be culturally, can actually be culturally competent. That's my editorial comment. So the social context, as I think I've just tried to demonstrate, is crucial to protecting individuals from death by suicide. Isolation, enemy number one. So all of us are on virtual Zooming here, and I'm jumping out of my skin trying to reach you, and I can't make eye contact. And when I come to events, I bring candy and I bring cookies and I bring stuff, and I can't do that here. And I can't validate, the eye contact to see if I'm getting across, or if I'm turning somebody off, or if someone's in pain because of something I'm sharing. And that's painful to me. As important as it is for me to do this, or to feel like I need to do this, I also walk away saying, what did I just do to these people? We clearly need to make changes. We need to help people who are unemployed, volunteering, being part of NAMI, going to the walk, things like that. Mentoring, as Catherine was talking about earlier. We need to be the village. And those villages have disappeared over the years, and now are even worse because of COVID. So, as I started to say, the Surgeon General report, I went ahead of myself a little bit. These are the groups that are most at risk in our culture: working age men, military service and veterans, American Indians. And by the way, if you look in terms of the COVID response, early on, so many American Indian, Native Americans were dying because of COVID, because of lack of treatment. And so many tribes have rallied to a very high degree of inoculation and self-protection at this point. Very exciting. Obviously, sexual and gender minority. The LGBTQ kids are seriously at risk. Older adults, as I shared, individuals in the system, child welfare, juvenile justice, and it stands to reason, if you believe and you accept what I said about trauma, can you imagine a kid in the child welfare system or in a juvenile justice setting that has not been traumatized? So it goes to it. Clearly, a history of suicidal behaviors puts people at risk. The exciting thing is 90% of people who attempt to take their life and don't succeed don't try again. That's really good news. Really bad news is there are 10%. So 10% of 47,000 last year would be 4,700 right off the top. And obviously people suffering from mental illness, substance abuse, and other medical conditions. So these are all things, and I will all with you, I don't have the statistic on a slide, but the Black Caucus has done a tremendous amount of work. At-risk behavior in Black adolescents, males and females, is up about 70% in the last 7 years. Now, that doesn't mean they all attempt to take their life, but it means the risk behaviors involved, which could lead to it. So I think that's an important thing to share. So in Broward County, as a result of deaths by suicide, the funders came together, Broward Behavioral Health Coalition, Broward, the county, and the United Way, and created a suicide prevention coalition, which I am part of. Sandra's part of it. And it's an attempt to do all of those things, or look at all of those things that I've been sharing for the last few minutes. Now, I think you're all here to talk about what drives people to be at risk of taking their life. And so that's really what I want to talk about. For me, and you can argue with me, I would love to have these discussions. For me, so much of what we determine about a Joel or a Kate or a Larry or a Sandra is about they are this thing. You are what you eat. But in the terms of this stuff, if you accept trauma, and if you're aware of adverse childhood experience research, it's more about what's happened to you instead of what you are. Now, what's happened to you makes you what you are, but if it's about what's happened to you, we can begin to help to address resilience. So much in the DSM, the mental handbook, is about saying you are this. My feeling is we throw that out the window and we say what's happened to you. And as we determine your behaviors from that, then we bring back the DSM to define what those behaviors are. So I want to talk a little bit about stress, trauma, anxiety, and depression. So this bears in the woods, right? Right? We all know the fight or flight phenomenon, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So Kate and I are out walking in the park, and the bear jumps out in front of us. And Kate, being brave, she's going to punch that bear in the nose. Me, not so much. I'm going to say, feet don't fail me now, and I'm going to run. Okay? But either way, that is a response that is not triggered here. That is a response that comes out of cortisol and adrenaline being released from your adrenal glands, which flows up through your brain, to the back of your head right here, which is called basically the lizard brain. It's called the lizard brain because it's the first developed part of the brain back millions of years ago. And that's where you're going to punch the bear in the nose or you're going to run like hell. But it doesn't only stop there. That sends a message to the front of your brain, the frontal lobe, which is where your executive decision making is made, where you can say to yourself, you take the instantaneous time to where Kate to say, I have muscles of Superman. If I punch that bear in the nose, it's going to run like hell and I'm going to be safe. Or it tells me, holy mackerel, I can run faster than anybody else. That bear can't catch me if I run. It tells me what decision to make. And I make that decision. Now, we have always felt that this area of your brain, this executive decision, becomes concrete at about 6 years old. It does not fully develop until you're about 25, young adulthood. This is critically important to this discussion. Critically important to this discussion, because if you're functioning from trauma, you have to make these decisions. And this area is not fully developed. The decisions you make are much more risky. So we call that mental illness. But I challenge you to think about the whole organism making this decision. And here is the validation for that. Of that. Bear jumps out in front of you and you run away. Your body says, don't pee. You can't pee. You can't have a bowel movement. Why? Well, because Kate can't turn around to that bear, put her hand up in front of its face and say, Mr. Bear, please don't eat me. I got to stop and pee. Your body, as an organism, drives all of the parts of it. For me, that's a critically important understanding as we get to the end of the few minutes I have with you, because it talks about it's not just here, it's all of us. So let's talk about stress. So Kate and I are in our walk in the park and we come to this little brook, and Kate, being an Olympic hurdler, jumps right across this brook. But me, not so much. And I have white sneakers on. And if I slip in the mud and I get my white sneakers dirty, my mom is going to just tear me up. So I have stress. This is good stress. This is positive stress. This is the stress that gets us to study for an algebra exam. This is the stress that gets us to prep for doing this presentation, the stress for a job interview. This is the kind of stress that helps us. Our adrenal glands are flowing cortisol and adrenaline to our lizard brain up to the front of our head, and we're making decisions. And my decision could be, I can look to the left and see if there's some wood that I can put across it and step across it. I can look to the right and see if there's a bridge. I can say, Kate, see you later, and I can leave. Because we seek homeostasis, calmness. Every decision we make to make ourselves calm is not a good one. Leaving in a positive stress situation is not a good one. Not studying for the algebra exam is not a good one. Not prepping for your interview is not a good one. We do unhealthy things to ourselves. Here's tie them together, wrap them around my neck, and just go over the brook. Okay, I've made a decision. And from that decision, I've learned I can do this. Okay, we keep walking. And we're walking a little further on, and we get to a river that's maybe 30 feet across. And Kate, being an Olympic swimmer, dives in and swims across, and she's over that in no time whatsoever. Now, me, not so much. I can barely float. So again, same scenario. I can look to the left, see if there's a boat somewhere. I can look for a bridge. I can say, see you later. Meanwhile, Kate's encouraging me like your teacher encourages you for your algebra exam or whatever it might be. And she said, Joel, it's only 2 feet deep. You don't even need to swim. So I can wrap my sneakers around my neck and I can wade across. And again, that's tolerable stress. It's more serious. There's more adrenaline and cortisol flowing into my brain, impacting my executive decision making ability. But I supersede it. Okay, that's tolerable stress. So that could be you lost your job and you're worried about maintaining your home. That can be you lose a spouse or a child or a grandmother. These are, we all react differently. We all react differently based on our whole package of experiences. So how I'm going to react to the loss of my grandmother may not be the same as Ian or Larry or anyone else on the call, or losing a job or whatever it might be. We all react differently. But Kate and I continue walking. And I go, This is toxic stress. This is PTSD. This is the level of cortisol and adrenaline flowing through us. We can't control it. We can't get back to a homeostasis model where we're calmed down. And again, being calm doesn't mean we're healthy. Because what are some of the ways people calm themselves down? Alcohol, drugs, risk-taking behavior. So I'm not saying that all the decisions we make in these incredibly difficult situations are healthy, but that cortisol and adrenaline that's flowing is totally interruptive. And by the way, so you have neurons in your brain all over, millions of them, billions of them. At the end of the neuron, they're covered with a substance called myelin, M-Y-E-L-I-N. The chemical flow eats the myelin, which kills neurons, which does what? Amongst other things, impact your decision making. So one of the things for our kids, when we look at them, those of you who have kids or grandchildren, is looking at how they're dealing with that stress. And women, please watch your trauma. Women, when they get before menopause, but in the late 30s, early 40s, you can look this up. That inflammation, that constant flow of cortisol and adrenaline from your trauma, eating away the myelin, creates inflammatory diseases in women, and which is not good. So We're all susceptible to these things. But back to the kids for just a minute. So we need to look at the impact of our kids and how we help them be resilient from the traumas that they faced. And a big part of that is the relationships. So what else do I have for you? Okay, so let me give you my picture of depression. In my front yard, over the last many years that I've lived here, I've tilled the lawn 3 times. So I have pebbles in my yard. I have a xeriscape. And let's say every day I come home from work and I'm processing my day of work and the stresses that I have, whether they be positive, tolerable, or toxic, depending on what they are. And I characterize that by putting a rock in my pocket. And I go in the house and I play with my dog, and my wife asks me how my day is, and I'm okay. I process that. And every day I put a pebble in my pocket. This is the point at which help is readily available. Depression impacts about 1 in 15 people in America. So what are they, 35 or 40 people in this room? A couple of us at some point can be considered diagnosable as chronically depressed. That's the bad news. The good news is it's treatable. It's treatable. People who find it not to be treatable don't stay with the treatments. They don't like the side effect of the medication. They don't, Kate is my therapist and she sucks. I can't relate to her. So instead of getting a different therapist, instead of going to Larry, who's a much more warm and engaging person, I just quit doing therapy. That's the problem. But I got these rocks in my pocket and I'm slowing down. And my wife is saying, what do you need to do, honey? And whatever it might be. But we get to a point where the rocks have immobilized me. Now you can still get help. And there are treatments for deep end depression. As I think we all know, there's ECT, there's TMS, which is the magnets. And now, believe it or not, I hate to say it, but the date rape drug, ketamine, Yale is doing some tremendous work on ketamine treatment. And people are even going in and getting consistent doses of ketamine. They can't do it themselves. It's a nasal spray that a doctor does in the office. And it buys time because it's a euphoric drug, which gives other therapeutic interventions a chance. So treatment is available, but you become frozen at that point. So anxiety typically can be described, at least in my opinion, as seeing light at the end of the tunnel. And the anxiety part is, am I going to get out of this tunnel? Is that light a train coming the other way? It's going to crash into me. But you can generally get past it because when you get out the other side. Now, that doesn't mean you won't get anxious at the next tunnel or the next or the next. Depression is the endless tunnel. Depression sees no hope. It's a hopeless, heartless, helpless feeling. People who have attempted to take their life and not succeeded will tell you about the physical pain they were in. Can't diagnose it, but the physical pain they were in. They will tell you it's like, I like to characterize it like, let's say you're in a house fire and you've been burned over a significant amount of your body. And you've had skin grafts and medication, and you've been in that bariatric tube and all kinds of stuff. And one day the doctor says to you, Joel, this is the best you're going to feel. This is it. There's no other treatment. And you're just in this pain. And you want to end the pain. Many, many, many people who attempt to take their lives will tell you they didn't want to die. They wanted to end the pain. Just an example as we're starting to wind down to show you, you can see the red dots, that's where your adrenal glands are. and some of the things that happen when the fight or flight response is initiated. I would take a lot more time on that, but we're running out. So let me just share some quickly, some stuff. This is Broward County data from 2020, and you'll see that death by suicide in 2020 was down 10%. On the one hand, we need to celebrate that. On the other hand, that scares the crap out of me, because opioid use is up tremendously. Alcohol use is up tremendously. Opioid deaths are up tremendously. Calls to helplines are up tremendously. I think one of the reasons that we can say death by suicide is down is because there's a theory that shows that we're all in this boat together. We're all depressed. We're all socially isolated. So my depression doesn't look any worse than Kate's or Larry's or Ian's or anybody else's. But once Kate moves into a new apartment and Ian does this and all that, and I'm stuck behind, now my depression explodes out again. And I think that there's some real validity to that. If you look, here's some documentation on the age groups death by suicide. Again, this is Broward County, but it's pretty reflective of national. And you can see it's the upper end that we really need to worry about. Males to females, women try to take their lives at a much higher rate than men, but men are infinitely more successful at it. Success, I say that facetiously. Why? Guns. Men typically use guns. When you put a gun in your mouth or a gun to your head, there really is no margin for error. Women typically, and again, I would tease this out if we were having a conversation, women more typically use medications, prescription drugs, which one, gives you a chance for someone to find you, or two, gives you a chance to say, holy crap, I'm making a mistake. In Broward County, you can see that there, but you can see the percentage of death by suicide is white. And in Broward County, our population, while we are still a higher white majority, when you factor in Black and Hispanic, it's much closer than it used to be. So it's a little shocking. Okay, so I talked a little bit about that. So I want to quickly get to the warning signs. And I'm happy to send this to you, Kate, if I haven't already. I think we need to be aware that death by suicide does not happen overnight. However, the final action may be impulsive and may happen overnight. There may be that final thing that happens. But we want to look at behavior change over time. We want to look at changes in eating habits over time. Sleep is a critical piece of it. Why? Because your body approaches homeostasis and controls the flow of adrenaline and cortisol at its peak when you're asleep. It physiologically brings the flow down. So one of the things for those of you who have kids, grandkids, or your own kids, watch for interruptions in their sleep patterns. It's ridiculous that high school kids start school early. They should be the last ones that start school. Not that they shouldn't go the same number of hours, but they should be the last ones that go. It's archaic. It goes back to the part-time job days and picking potatoes in Maine 150 years ago. Trouble concentrating and being indecisive. I mean, I think that speaks for itself. Withdrawal from your friends, family, or social activities. Unexplained apathy or fatigue. Obviously, lack of joy. Loss of interest in whatever it is. Diminished sexual drive or interest in your personal appearance. Giving away prized possessions is a tremendous predictor and suggester. So I'm a huge baseball fan and a big New York Yankee fan. So I'm a little depressed right now. But I have an autographed baseball by Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. So if you know them, they're two Hall of Famers and historic baseball players. If I was to have lunch with Kate tomorrow and I was to give her that baseball, she should be worried about me. And we see kids bringing in like an autographed poster of whatever the youth rock group is and giving it away to their friends. We should be worried about that youth. Obviously, a preoccupation with death. So many people talk about, that pre-suicide ideation. If you're talking about death, that's somewhere on the arc of wellness, and we need to address that. There's some interruption in what's going on with that person. Unexpected, recent losses, medications. So you can see those, extreme anxiety. These are some critical things both for depression and for suicide. So I wanted to share that with you. And it's very important. These are the Columbia questions. When you've gone through those 20 questions and you've seen me give away the baseball and all of that stuff, you've got to have the gumption to say to Joel, are you thinking of harming yourself? You've got to have the commitment to say, are you thinking of killing yourself? Have you made a plan? Do you have the means to carry out that plan? Have you picked a time? And if the answer to any of those is yes, you cannot leave that person alone. You can't say, wait a minute, stay here, I'll go get help, because Joel will take off. Because I don't want to be Baker acted. I want to deal with what I'm dealing with. But you got to call for help. That's the point at which a person needs to be evaluated. And unfortunately, Baker Act is the way we do that. It may not be the best way, but it's the tool we have. So some of you may have seen some of this. These are really, I've taken these from NAMI because I think they're terrific. So I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on them. You can get these off the NAMI websites, but I think these are some really important resources to be aware of. We know that 1 in 20 people in America will suffer every year, and 1 in 15 will be depressed. 1 in 13 will suffer from anxiety. We know these things, but we know they're treatable. Nobody wants to lose a loved one to death by suicide. It hurts. So we need, in closing, we need to address the stigma about mental health. We need to address where people are on the arc of wellness and help them find a better way. Because you would not say somebody committed cancer. You would not say somebody committed a heart attack or somebody committed diabetes. But we do say somebody committed suicide. We shouldn't say that. If everything I've said in this brief presentation about the adrenal glands and the flow of cortisol and adrenaline, which changes the function of your brain, and your inability to poop when a bear faces you in the woods, then you will say, wait a minute, it's the body. It's the same thing as cancer. It's the same thing as diabetes. So we should not say committed suicide. We should say died by suicide. And from now on, when you hear somebody say committed suicide, it should trigger in you a conversation with that person. Because when we don't do that, that's when we're saying to somebody who's suffering from depression or anxiety, come on, Joel, you can get through this. Come on, just tough it out. And if you understand my burning analogy and you buy into my visual of depression, they can't. They can't. We are the village, ladies and gentlemen, and we need to be nurturing and supportive to each other in a world that's often filled with not much nurturing and not much support.
Oh, Joel, thank you so much. That was wonderful.